Hello and welcome to another episode of the Pro Peace Report. I'm Kobe. Today we'll be interviewing Kloe, one of my classmates in our Human Rights Studies degree here at Lund University in Sweden. So Kloe, how are you doing today?
All good, thanks. How about yourself?
Pretty good. Sleepy. Drinking coffee.
Yep.
So today the topics we're going to talk about, the two main topics that I wanted to talk about, and since you're from Chile, you'll be able to give us a really good firsthand account. I want to talk about the upcoming elections, so the past election that just happened and now the runoff that's going to happen afterwards, and the whole constitutional rewrite in general, so the protests that sparked it and where it's gone since and where it's going from here. So first, just tell everybody, why did you decide to study human rights in Sweden, and what's your general political worldview? Like, what's your ideology? How do you look at politics generally?
Well, I think I decided for human rights because I always had this interest in migration, given my family's history. But then I did an internship at Chile's National Human Rights Institute right after the social uprisings, and I bumped into this terrible situation of human rights violations that was systematic. And then that's when I came to realize that that was actually my interest. And also migration comes within human rights. So I think that human rights can give a broad perspective to all these problematics.
Nice. Yeah, that was similar development for me in the sense that one of the things that kind of inspired me to want to get my master's degree in human rights was going to the uprisings in D.C. During the Black Lives Matter protests and all of the human rights abuses that got perpetrated on us at those protests. So I can completely see where you're coming from. In terms of do you think of politics in terms of socialism, capitalism, communism? Where would you put yourself economically and then socially also?
I mean, for sure, my political views have been shaped by the neoliberalism that's been dominant in Chile. I've been talking a lot with different people, and I do believe that our political views are shaped by our local experiences. And I wouldn't define myself necessarily as a socialist, but definitely towards socialism. I don't consider myself engaged with certain ideologies, but it would be for sure, and given Chile's experience, towards the left.
And so talk about that a little bit, the 2018 when the uprisings were happening
2019.
in Chile? 2019. Yeah. So what were they based around? What were the demands based around, and how did it lead to a constitutional convention?
So it basically all started with an increase in the metro fare in Santiago. So I did some calculations because it's all in pesos, but basically the metro fare used to be 800 pesos. Okay, so nowadays 849 pesos is $1. So the metro was 90 cents of a dollar per pass. And then they increased it by 30 pesos, okay? Which isn't even that much if you think about it. But you have to consider that the minimum wage in Chile is $396. And about 50% of the population earns $471 or less. So the increase in the metro fare clearly affected the working class. But I think that what was worse was what came after that, because people started protesting about it. And the president of Chile, which is one of the richest men on earth, he was like, yeah, we're not going to do anything about it. And I think, which is actually worse than that, was that the Ministry of Economics said, well, if you don't like this increase in the metro fare, just wake up early at 5 a.m. and use the metro before 6 a.m. because it's cheaper. So this was the way I see it, and the way many people saw it, is that politicians who are high class were not really being empathic with the working class, and they were just literally making fun of them in their faces. And also what happened in the news, they would interview Congress people and, do you know how much the metro fare is? And they're like, no, not really. I have no idea how much it is. So it was this disconnection between politicians and the working class that made everyone so furious about this. Now, it's also important to consider that what started to happen was that different students, like high school students, started leading the protest, and they would get inside the metros. I can actually send you some videos after this, calling people for not to pay for their ticket. So that's how it all started, like a protest. And then because of the politicians' affirmations and all this, like not being empathic with the working class, led to this motto: it's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years, which refers to the installment of the neoliberalism policies in the dictatorship that led to profound inequalities in Chile. And people were just tired of that, actually. This was just a clear example of this.
Yeah, it's like the straw that broke the camel's back. It kind of reminds me of like the Gilets jaunes in France, and how I think that all sparked out of a gas tax of some sort, which again, the government would have thought, oh, you know, that's just a small gas tax. It's not that big of a deal. Don't you have to carry your fair share to deal with climate change? But to the public who is working class or poor, like a small increase in a gas tax, that's a big deal. Or in New York City, you know, the metro fares, people do the same sort of thing where they jump turnstiles and get in. And so, well, I want to talk about that neoliberalism aspect, because I think that's so relevant to the upcoming election.
For sure.
Because I know that, so Gabriel Boric is the socialist candidate, the left-wing candidate. He got second place in the original vote, the preliminary vote, but who got first place is very controversial. It's José Kast, I think his name. And he,
José Antonio Kast,
He basically said that, he thought that Pinochet was a good leader, and that he doesn't want to break from his neoliberal economic policies. And I watched a video last night of Boric talking about how there was a mindset in Chile a few years ago where, oh, you know, if all of these economic indicators are going up, if overall GDP is going up, if we look better than other Latin American countries, why is everybody so upset? But completely ignoring the inequality created by neoliberalism. So can you talk about Pinochet, his legacy, and how Kast is going to carry forward a similar legacy if he were to win?
Well, let's hope not. I mean, I still have faith that Boric will win. But I just wanted to do like a small correction. So basically, Boric is not socialist per se. We have a socialist party, which our former president Michelle Bachelet is part of. He's part of Frente Amplio, which is a new political party that was founded by young people who were actually student union leaders. So Gabriel Boric is a former student union leader from Universidad de Chile for some years. I don't remember. I was in high school, but I remember him. So going back to this whole Pinochet thing, basically during the Pinochet era, which was from 1973 to 1989, they installed a series of policies, of neoliberalist policies, which means that they leave everything up to the market. So you privatize everything. And in practical terms, and in Chile nowadays, that means that if you have money and if you can pay for good insurance, you will have treatment for whatever illness you have. If you want to receive good education, you need money. You need to be from high class or middle to high class. And basically, people who do not have money, which is the majority of the country, are left out in the public system with waiting lines to receive cancer treatment. So people die waiting. And then, which is terrible, is that then politicians are like, oh yeah, you should plan like an event, like a fundraising event, which is not, it's just not, I don't know. It's like poor people in Chile do not live a dignified life. That's the problem about the whole thing. And the rich people in Chile have so much. It's about like this, it's the inequality that upset people and that made them realize with this metro thing that enough is enough. I mean, it makes no sense.
So what do you think in terms of like, what type of policies is Boric proposing that would fix those problems?
Well, so many things, but he wants to raise the minimum wage. He wants to change the pension system, which is privatized nowadays. So many old people in Chile, senior citizens, earn less than the minimum wage. And that, like, for their elder years. So that's just terrible. He wants to change that. He wants to have a universal healthcare system. So many things that would just make it a bit more equal, you know, like give a bit more dignity to the working class.
Yeah, I mean, those are the same type of problems we have in the U.S. too.
Yeah.
And so it's not a surprise that the U.S. used to be so supportive of Pinochet. because
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same sort of neoliberal economic policies that we've been doing in the U.S. since at least Reagan, and then Clinton continued it. And I think that's what's so frustrating for people in the U.S. is that both parties participate in that sort of inequality. They think that if you can make the GDP go up, if you can make the unemployment percentage go down, the poverty rate percentage go down, then you must be doing a good thing. But they don't consider the ways that poor people are constantly squeezed out of the market and inequality is not fixed. So how do people in Chile tend to think about their political system? I've heard that there's a lot of distrust in politicians broadly and political parties just in general across the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, there's this phenomena of poor people who actually support some of Pinochet's policies because it's this idea ingrained in people's minds that if you are poor, it's because you are lazy. So there are obviously some stories of people who were poor and then they made it, but that's not the general rule. It's just specific cases. So some people who are affected by this system still believe that it's a good system, which for me is very problematic. But I do believe that after the social uprisings, many people realize that that's not like we can do so much better. Now, about the social uprisings, I feel that there is a change like pre-social uprising and after it. And I feel that people now have a lot more faith in what we can do, especially with the constitutional process. Like the constitutional process will not change everything, but it will allow for changes to be made. Because before this whole process, if, for instance, you want an educational reform, it's like, oh, we cannot do that. It's unconstitutional because Pinochet's constitution doesn't allow it. So it doesn't necessarily create specific changes, but it does lead to a new era in which Chile can be so much better for all of the citizens, not just for the rich ones.
And so what is like the semantical, like what are the details of that constitutional rewrite? Like how did that happen? Is there something in Chile's constitution that allowed for there to be that kind of constitutional convention? Because I, as an American, get very inspired about the idea of rewriting the constitution. Ours doesn't include the right to housing. Ours doesn't include the right to food, the right to healthcare and things like that either. And so I'm curious, like how did your country make that happen?
I mean, I think that because of this motto, no son 30 pesos, son 30 años. It's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years. More and more people started to, be involved in the protests. And then protests started getting bigger and bigger. And there was this beautiful protest. I was there. It was the biggest protest after the return of the democracy in 1989 in Chile's history. And then people were just calling for change. And then it was just different things. It wasn't even about the metro fare anymore. People were just protesting against inequality, against the pension system, against the health system. So people having in mind that so many changes that we needed were not allowed with the constitution, people starting to demand this new constitutional change. And that's when Piñera called for a referendum. And the referendum was, well, I'm really bad with dates, but it was about a year ago. And it was either approve for a new constitution or reject, and approve had a vast majority, like 70, I don't know.
Like 78%. I have to go. Or something like that. I watched it yesterday. I watched it a little bit.
Yeah, and so that's how it all started, and then it was like, okay, how will we do this? And also, what was voted, which is something that is so good, is that it is being written with gender equality. So half the constituyentes, where people who are writing the constitution, are women, which is also amazing. There are reserved seats for indigenous people, and I don't know if you know, but Elisa Loncón, who is from the Mapuche indigenous group, she's the president of the convention. So all these, like, I feel that this process has not finished yet, because there will be a referendum once this constitution is finished. We have to vote if we approve it or not. So we cannot still like sing victory. It's not over. But I do feel that these symbolic changes are revealing of like the new Chile that people want now, like gender equality, more space for indigenous people who have been repressed throughout history. So I have a lot of hope in this. But then again, the downside of the social uprisings was that there was a lot of violence, because people were fed up. I mean, I don't condone it, but I can understand it. So there was also like this group of people that are like, yeah, we're tired of violence. And I feel that José Antonio Kast is like what these people want, because he's like, yeah, we're going to take all the military to the street. We won't have any more violence. So like some part of the population can sort of relate to him. Like, I think it's nonsense, because like violence and oppression just leads to more violence. But I just, like, these days I've been trying to think like, why? I've been reading a lot also. And that's what made me kind of get the sense to this whole thing of this José Antonio Kast phenomena.
Yeah, I mean, we have a similar tendency in the U.S. where it's like, you know, the Black Lives Matter protests turned into riots sometimes, and then it led people, I don't know, to militias going out to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and then policing protesters themselves. So average people acting like police, and like, it's so complicated because, like, you know, we're not condoning violence, but at the same time, the same people who claim to be against the violence are the same people who want the police to be violent, or the same people who want the military to be violent. So it's not even like they're against violence generally. It's who's doing the violence and why that they often disagree with. Because many of the same people probably don't agree with the protesters' demands either. So it's not just that they don't agree with the violence, they don't agree with getting rid of neoliberalism. And it's like, so how do we confront that sort of issue? How do we get them to see the hypocrisy of supporting the state violence against people uprising against oppression?
And also understanding that there is a lot of symbolic violence in inequality as well. Like, people who are told like, oh yeah, you can't go out the streets and you can't do this, you will be repressed. But like, they've been going through a lot given the inequality. So like, I think we also have to have that in mind to understand why people are so fed up. I think that's
it's
important.
Like the straw that broke the camel's back again, because people don't think of depriving poor people of health care as being violence. They don't think of denying people adequate housing as being violence. But like, if you talk to the protesters who usually do riot or engage in what people would consider violence, usually that's what they'll say, is that we did it because we have nothing left to lose anymore. You've already taken our health care, you've already taken our housing, you've already taken everything we need. So at this point, you know, we're fighting back against oppression. But it's so hard to bridge that gap. And there's the fear, I think, of a reaction to revolutionary ideas. So like, you all had your uprisings, you had a new constitution getting written now. The people who got elected to the Constitutional Assembly tend to be more left-leaning people. But then now with Kast getting 28% in the first round, and there were third and fourth and fifth candidates, some more conservative candidates I saw down ballot who potentially got enough to where Kast could win, potentially, in the next round. And what would you fear that would do? Like, would there be any impact on the constitutional process if you were to see that sort of reaction?
I mean, I think that there could be problems to funding. There could be like a boycott to the process, but the process is ongoing. I fear a bit more for human rights situation in Chile if José Antonio Kast wins, because he is homophobic, so it's like a direct threat to the LGBTQ plus community. He is sexist. I don't know if you've read through his program, but the word woman appears about 4 times. One is to say that he wants to eliminate the Ministry of Women because he sees no sense into it. He wants to restrict the power that the UN has in Chile, whatever that means. He wants to close the National Human Rights Institute. So I think that the constitutional process is one thing. It's legitimized. So I don't think he can cancel it or anything, but there is a huge threat for human rights in Chile if José Antonio Kast is elected.
And so to move a little bit, just to talk more generally about Latin America, how do you generally feel about the situation in Latin America in general when it comes to human rights, when it comes to democracy and things like that? How do you feel when it comes to Chavismo, for example? Because I'm of the belief, it's very controversial in the U.S. to talk about Venezuela, or very controversial to talk about Nicaragua. But then at the same time, it's like, there are people there. There's a democratic process, even if there are maybe flaws in their democratic process, as there is in the U.S. too. It does seem like there is a genuine desire for socialism throughout Latin America, and that often the U.S. comes in to support people like Kast or neoliberal oppositional figures to kind of prevent socialism from taking root in Latin America. How have you seen, all of these tensions throughout Latin America between neoliberalism and socialist ideas? What's your general take on it?
It's very polarized, and usually in Latin America, it's like, oh yeah, government's left wing, government right wing, and it's like very left or right. I do have my critique to Chavez for sure. We also have a lot of migrants, Venezuelan migrants in Chile,
Mm.
and yeah, actually in Chile there was a lot of comment on the human rights report on Venezuela and how some political politicians from the Communist Party wouldn't want to acknowledge it. For me, like as I said, like I don't engage in any ideology specifically, but like where there is human rights violations, like I disagree. Um, I do believe that since there was a lot of repression in the 70s to certain left wing politics and politicians in general, that like we just had the opposite, you know, like the extreme opposite. So of course I feel that people are seeing certain socialist ideas as a way to improve their lives, which is for sure like a thing. I do believe that but I think that it's also because we've had like the most extreme opposite version of it.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, I just think that there's so much extremes in Latin America, and so much also, yeah, like the U.S. intervention. We cannot deny like the power that it had in the past, and the power that it has today. I mean, recently in Bolivia there was a coup attempt that was backed by the U.S. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yeah.
And I don't know much about Evo, but I do know that people in Bolivia like him, and that's what it counts. I mean, that's what democracy is
Yeah.
about. Yeah, and I think that interventionism is not a good thing. People should be participant of their own democracies, and whatever that entails, you know.
Yeah. I completely agree. It's such a
Yeah.
controversial topic talking about U.S. intervention in Latin
Yeah.
America, because it's like
Yeah.
the reason that we would usually say that we're doing it for human rights reasons. We would say
Well,
we
yeah.
think that the Bolivian government is committing human rights abuses. We think the Venezuelan government is committing human rights abuses. And even if there are specific examples where maybe that has happened, you always see, I feel like, this ulterior motive of not wanting to see neoliberalism challenged, not wanting to see markets limited. So like in Venezuela, for example, is it a coincidence that we are so harsh on their, Bolivarian revolution that we don't want, because we don't want them to nationalize their oil fields. We want U.S. oil companies to be able to go in and profit off of those oil. Or in Bolivia, I don't know if you've seen the tweet. There was an Elon Musk tweet about the coup in Bolivia where he said, "Oh, we can coup whoever we want." You know, talking about the lithium in Bolivia.
Yeah, it was all about the lithium.
And that's where it gets so complicated. Is like there might be specific examples of their police using riot tactics that we would disagree with in the U.S. that we would disagree with in Chile. You know what I mean? That even socialist governments sometimes engage in those sorts of things, but it comes off as hypocritical, I think, to people in Venezuela or Bolivia when the United States government, who just beat up all our protesters in the streets, or Chile, beats up all our it's like we're doing the same exact human rights abuse, but then we think that we have the right to overthrow another country's government over this kind of human rights abuse. And you see it so consistently with the U.S. That's why it's weird, because to me it makes it so that I'm so much more sympathetic to controversial ideas that come out of Latin America, just because I understand that, I mean, that's the self-determination. And I think that's like, we talk about self-determination a lot in human rights studies in our program.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you think we deal with that globally? Because one of the biggest ways that you see the US and Europe often try to manage human rights situations is that they'll do it through not recognizing elections, or they'll do it through sanctions on the country.
Yeah.
But then, in my opinion, those sanctions end up depriving those countries of medicine and depriving those countries of food. And even if it's for a good reason, there's a real human rights abuse behind maybe the sanctions sometimes. You often create human rights abuses with sanctions. And so what do you think we should do? Like, how do you avoid that issue of creating more human rights abuses with sanctions while still confronting the human rights abuses that happen? Like, what do you think we could do about that?
I mean, I have no answer, but this topic definitely gets to me because I don't know if I ever told you, I'm half Iranian. I have a lot of family in Iran. Iran has been hit by sanctions. I would never condone the regime in Iran. But But then again, like it's the average people that get affected by this, and like people who are not having access to their medicine, people who's like the economy going really bad just because of like a thing of power dynamics. I mean, the US wouldn't impose sanctions on Saudi Arabia, which is also very, it has a lot of human rights violations.
We give them hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that this whole human rights discourse in international politics is, I mean, I don't always buy it. I think that it has a lot more to do with, you know, political interest, economic interest. And the bad thing about this whole messed up situation is that average people get affected by it. So that's not a very human rightsy thing to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know how you necessarily deal with that. That's why I've always been of the belief of like, I try to call out the sanctions. I try to call out what I see as the imperialism or the geopolitical games that you see being played around human rights. And that's like why I wanted to study human rights studies, was because I wanted to know the human rights language that they're using to perpetuate wars or perpetuate sanctions that deprive people of resources, so that I could show people like, look, like there might be a real human rights abuse here that these countries are complaining about, but they do the same thing and they're creating more human rights abuses in a cycle of violence with the way they're trying to deal with it. And it's so complicated because like I agree with democracy. I agree with, you know, ending economic inequality, like, you know, fixing all the human rights problems. I'm a feminist. I'm a trans-inclusionary feminist. You know what I mean? So it's like, I agree with a lot of the critiques that often get made of other countries, but like, it's just the hypocrisy of it. Like, are we really helping the North Korean people by sanctioning the government if they're now one of the most impoverished countries in the world and no country will trade with them? And so now they both can't overthrow their government, you know, because they don't feel like they either don't want to or they don't have the power to. And now they're living in poverty, in worse poverty, because we're trying to help them. And it's like, that's the big issue, I think, with imperialism and human rights, is that it often good intentions are lost through the actions that seem hypocritical. The politics of it makes it easy to lose it. And it's like, that's the craziest thing. But so what do you want to do after college? What's your, what do you potentially want to do human rights wise?
I've been really interested in transitional justice. We had a transitional justice process in Chile after the dictatorship. I know some political asylum seekers that got to Sweden. I've been in contact with them here in Lund. And I think it's really interesting to look at what's going to happen in Chile after the uprisings, because there were a lot of human rights violations. We really didn't go into it, but there were like many eye trauma victims. You see, the police in Chile use rubber bullets, okay? And, and let me just, 1 second.
Are you pulling something up on your phone?
Yes, just so I don't get the, so the police in Chile uses rubber bullets, and the protocols say that they have to point 45 degrees towards the ground so that they bounce on the floor and hit people's legs. But in Chile, what the police did was that they would aim 90 degrees. So a lot of people got hit in their eyes. And this happened hundreds of cases in all of Chile. So the head of the National Human Rights Institute was like, oh, yeah, we don't know if it's systematic. We don't know if the human rights violations are systematic. I believe they are. Many people know they are. I mean, there's no doubt. So I'm really interested to know what's going to happen in terms of transitional justice. We are seeing now some cases that are getting to courts, but a lot of protection to the police institution, which is just, for me, it's like no respect for human rights. And like the victims are left blind for life because a cop disagreed with what they were doing. I don't know. I mean, I'm really interested in transitional justice. I don't know if it's going to be Chile, but I think that I'm really eager to know what's going to happen with this whole process afterwards, to see what's going to happen with the constitution. I have a lot of hopes. I also have a lot of hopes for Boric. I really think that he is what Chile needs right now. We really need change. Like, we need dignity for everyone, not just those who can afford it, you know?
How do you define transitional justice? Like, what do you mean by that term? Is it just about moving from, you know, the human rights abuse to solving it? Like, what does that mean exactly?
I mean, yeah, for me, it's very, the concept itself, what does it mean? It's like there's like 4 pillars to it. So it's truth, justice, guarantees of non-repetition, and indemnization. So that's what you do when there are human rights violations. And in Chile, we had that after the dictatorship. As I said, there were like truth committees. People whose human rights were violated receive money from the state until nowadays. Now, if you ask me, is that good? I mean, I don't know if it's good. Like, there were human rights violations. Like, no matter how much money the state pays you, it's not really, it doesn't change the past. But yeah, so I really hope at least to see some justice. Like, that's what people need. Like, you cannot give them their eyes back. You can just give them justice, which is like the least you can do for like the perpetrators to be in jail, you know? So that's what I expect from it. That's what the way I see transitional justice is, like, yeah, starting for justice.
Yeah. That's a big issue that unfortunately in America doesn't look like we're going to get any of that with the people who lost their own eyes at our Black Lives Matter protests.
Yeah.
Or, like, I think it's so crazy how chemical weapons are banned in war zones, but when it comes to using tear gas or other chemical type of weapons against civilian populations by police, for some reason that's allowed under international law. Like, it's so crazy how even a war crimes, something that could be considered a war crime in a war zone is considered okay for police to use domestically. And it's like, I'm sure that other countries, like, again, to bring it back to the idea of Venezuela or Bolivia or China or other countries that we call human rights abusers, you know, the US will call them all these things for repressing protests, for beating down on them with the police state. And, like, I tend to think that whether you're communist, socialist, or capitalist, state violence isn't, it doesn't discriminate. State violence happens regardless of the ideology of your state.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's hypocritical in the US, who has the world's biggest prison population in the world, who police shoot 1,000 people a year in the US. Yeah. Then we want to go put sanctions on countries for their police state. And, like, I get it. Like, I wish we could have a dialogue about those things. Like, to me, the way that I think you avoid having this geopolitical battle is just to not be coercive to other countries when you're doing the same exact thing. You know what I mean? Like Chile. The U.S. would probably not want to overthrow the government of Chile. You know what I mean? We wouldn't want regime change in Chile, even though they beat a bunch of people in the streets. Or Colombia, for example. That's a huge U.S. ally in South America. Also a really brutal police state, but they're capitalists. The U.S. is okay with it. It's like, to me, it's just so interesting how ideology is what decides, like, what countries like each other and don't like each other.
Yeah.
But the state violence is
universal, basically.
It's something that every country does, except they justify it in a different way. So
yeah, and so,
go ahead.
I was going to say that something really messed up that happened in Chile recently was that there's this thing called Becas Chile, Chile scholarships that finances people to do PhD masters abroad. And it was canceled due to budgetary problems because of COVID-19. But Chile decided to buy weapons to the US like the same year in the same budget. So it's like, we don't want people to be educated, but we do want, like, to have instruments to repress our own people. So I think that's just, it says a lot. It says a lot about, like, all the things that are wrong in Chile. And
Can you describe
just to talk about it,
like,
it's very frustrating.
What do you know about Chile's, like, foreign policy? Like, I don't know anything about it personally. Like, how does Chile usually engage in foreign policy? Like, you just said they did an arms sale with the U.S. I mean, I never knew anything about that. Like, can you describe a little bit about the foreign policy of Chile?
I mean, yeah, Chile is an ally of the U.S. for sure, because of our right-wing government, Piñera. I think that, Chile in general is perceived as like, developed country in Latin America, a stable country, because we used to have a solid economy up until the uprisings. I mean, it was a solid economy in, like, data and numbers, but not in, like, people's dignity. So I think that always had, like, the image set of Chile. And also, about 2 weeks before Chile exploded with these social uprisings, Piñera was in a meeting, I don't know, somewhere, and he was like, oh yeah, actually Chile is like the paradise of Latin America because we have so much stability, we have so much foreign investment. And yeah, the thing is, we do have that, and it's not bad, but, like, we also have a lot of inequality. So that's what people usually don't really consider when they talk about like how amazing Chile is in terms of like comparing to Latin America.
So
But
that made me think of a question I had that relates to our classes, actually. So how do you feel about the whole divide of right to sustenance or challenging inequality? Do you think it's enough to get people to a basic level of sustenance, or do you think that inequality more broadly is something that should be challenged?
I think it's inequality more broadly, because when we talk about subsistence, you know, poverty alleviation, I've seen that firsthand in Chile, and it's not enough, you know, like people, just because they have a house doesn't mean that they have good living conditions. And for me, it's more about having a more equal system. I don't have anything necessarily like against people having money. I don't have anything against that. But I do think that if people have money while others are dying of hunger or because they don't have access to health care, it makes no sense. Like, what's the point of it? And that's the case of Chile. Basically, we have like these mansions. We have people having more than one house, a house in the beach, a house in the lake, and then we have other people who live in camps. And I will share an Instagram post that I saw recently with you, so that you can see it like in photos and like, you know what I mean, like have a bit more of context of this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge reason why, like, when it comes to, like, I like the idea of political democracy on one hand, but I don't think we should lose sight of like economic democracy. Because to me, it's like, if you had it so that workplaces were democratically operated, so that you weren't being told what to do by an authoritarian management who you have no control over because you're just a worker. If workers would never give themselves poverty level wages. If they had a democratic vote at their workplace, they would never do that. They would never deprive themselves of health care at work. Like, you know what I mean? So like political democracy helps, but you could have the most democracy in the world politically, and if you don't have democracy at your job, then it's only democracy one day a year. Is kind of how I've always seen it, or 2 days a year, whenever you actually vote. But so it's like that seems to be one of the big divides that we have between the left and the right generally, and that's like a global phenomenon. It looks like where people on the right, maybe we both kind of agree on political democracy, kind of, sorta, but they're more okay with the idea of, the wealthy earned their money the fair way, and so they have more power to spend on fundraising or media campaigns for politics. It's just so crazy. But any last words? I think we've gotten most of the big topics out of the way. You talked a little bit about the student protests. You talked about the uprisings, the police brutality. You've talked about the upcoming election. You know, so any last words? How do you want the world to see Chile and their current process, and where do you think it could go from here, for the better or for the worse? Like, what do you see happening?
I think definitely we should have some hope in Chile's process. And like, as we've been reading, human rights are revolutionary. People need to demand their rights. The downside of this whole thing is that there will be police brutality, there will be repression, there will be human rights violations, and that is a terrible thing. But I do have faith in this whole constitutional process. I do have faith that things will be better in Chile. We will fight against inequality, and that we will give a little bit more dignity to the working class. So hopefully everything will be better. We will have to vote the new constitution via a referendum in about a year. So maybe in a year things are better, I hope. 19th of December we will vote for the second round presidential vote. Hopefully Gabriel Boric will win. I think he's a great candidate. He has what it needs for what Chile is going through right now. So yeah. Yeah,
I feel the same way. I mean, it's crazy to me because, like, I don't know enough about Chilean politics, so I don't know enough to say exactly how I would feel about Boric. Maybe I'd want him to be more openly socialist. Maybe I'd want him to be more openly leftist. But from how it sounds, people in Chile do think he is that. They do think he's the left extreme in a sense, and people think that Kast is the right extreme. They call him the Trump of Chile, is how I've seen people refer to him.
Yes.
So hopefully that works out. I do think that, in America, it's so hard for me because we have a similar dynamic where maybe the Democrat is better than the Republican, but it's like a lesser of two evils where they're better, but then they end up in practice not being better. I hope it's different in Chile. I hope that he actually ends up truly being better than Kast. And the constitutional process, again, I'm so inspired by that idea. I've wanted to try and figure out how to emulate that in the US because I do think we need human rights put into the Constitution. Like how can Kenya have the right to housing in their Constitution? But then the United States, who we claim our Constitution is the best in the world, we don't have the right to housing, the right to clean water, the right to food, the right to a clean environment in our Constitution. And it sounds like Chile has a chance to do that. I've watched videos of indigenous activists talking about the right to clean water, the right to a clean environment, and things like that potentially being included in this Constitution.
Yeah.
So thank you for telling me about all of this today. It's been very informational. I'm sure I'll have to have you come on again if as things change after the election, maybe, or as things develop.
For sure.
But
for sure.
Thank you so much, Kloe. I'll see you in class.
Thank you for the invite. See you. Bye.
Peace.